It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Alistair Sterling laughed as he poured red wine over Julianna Vance's dress in front of the entire board. The vintage Cabernet, dark as a fresh bruise, bloomed across the ivory silk of her bodice, the liquid soaking through the delicate fabric to hit her skin with a jarring chill. The room, a cavernous gallery filled with the cloying, sweet scent of lilies and the hushed murmurs of the city's elite, fell into a sudden, suffocating silence. Julianna didn't flinch. She stood perfectly still, her hands steady at her sides, as the wine dripped from her hem onto the polished marble floor. The sound of the droplets tap, tap, tap seemed to echo louder than the gasps of the onlookers. "Oh, Julianna," Alistair said, his voice dripping with a mock concern that didn't reach his cold, predatory eyes. He didn't bother to set the glass down, instead twirling it by the stem. "I forgot you were standing there. You've always been so good at blending into the background, like a shadow or a stain." Victor Thorne, standing at Alistair's right hand, let out a sharp, jagged bark of a laugh. The CFO adjusted his silk tie, his eyes raking over Julianna with blatant dismissiveness. To his left, Judge Lawrence Miller looked on, his expression one of mild boredom, as if Julianna were a minor clerical error rather than a human being. "Alistair, really?" Evelyn Sterling sighed, stepping forward. She didn't look at her daughter's face. Instead, she reached out with a manicured hand to adjust the diamond brooch on her own lapel. The diamonds caught the light, throwing sharp, jagged reflections across the room. "You've ruined the rug. Julianna, dear, you really should have moved. You always were such a clumsy child." Julianna finally looked at her mother. The woman who had birthed her didn't offer a napkin or a word of comfort. Evelyn's only concern was the social friction of the moment. Julianna felt the familiar, dull ache in her chest, but she pushed it down, burying it under years of practiced iron discipline. She wasn't that girl anymore. She wasn't the broken daughter they had cast out 5 years ago with nothing but a suitcase and a tarnished name. "It's just wine, Mother," Julianna said. Her voice was low, melodic, and terrifyingly calm. It cut through the tension like a razor through silk. Alistair stepped closer, invading her personal space. He smelled of expensive cigars and the arrogance of a man who had never been told no asterisk. He leaned in, his breath hot against her ear. "You shouldn't have come back, Julianna. This isn't your world. You don't have the pedigree, and you certainly don't have the wallet. Why don't you go back to whatever gutter you've been crawling in? I'll have Victor send you a check for the cleaning bill. Consider it charity." He pulled back, a smirk twisting his handsome, cruel face. He expected her to cry. He expected her to flee the room in a fit of humiliated sobs, just like she had the night they took everything from her. Instead, Julianna reached up and slowly wiped a stray drop of wine from her cheek. She looked at the red stain on her fingertip, then back at Alistair. "Charity is a noble pursuit, Alistair, but I think you'll find that I'm more interested in acquisitions these days." Victor Thorne snorted. "Acquisitions? What are you acquiring, Julianna? More thrift store rags? You're a ghost. A nobody." Julianna's gaze shifted to Victor. She knew the CFO had been skimming from the Sterling accounts for years, hiding his tracks behind Alistair's ego. She also knew that the loan Alistair had just taken out to fund the Sterling-Thorne merger was currently being traded on the secondary market. She reached into her small, modest clutch and felt the cool, brushed metal of her encrypted phone. Marcus Reed had sent the confirmation text 10 minutes ago. The trade was complete. "I'm a ghost who knows where the bodies are buried, Victor," she said softly. Alistair's eyes narrowed. For a fleeting second, his smirk faltered. The confidence that usually radiated from him like a heat lamp flickered. He looked at her, really looked at her, noticing for the first time the way she held herself. The way her eyes didn't dart away. The way she didn't seem bothered by the ruined silk or the judgment of the room. "Enough of this," Alistair snapped, waving a hand as if dismissing a servant. "Security will see you out. And Julianna, don't bother showing up at the board meeting tomorrow. You've been officially removed from the Legacy Trust. You're nothing to the Sterling name." "The name is Vance now, Alistair," she replied, her voice steady. "And you're right. I won't be at the board meeting as a Sterling." She turned on her heel, the wet silk of her dress clinging to her legs. She walked through the center of the gallery, her head held high. She passed Judge Lawrence Miller, who didn't even turn his head. She passed her mother, who was already busy charming a local senator, acting as if her daughter had never existed. As she reached the heavy oak doors of the estate, Julianna pulled out her phone. The screen glowed in the dim light of the foyer. She swiped it open and hit the speed dial. "Marcus," she said as the call connected. "I'm here, Julianna." Marcus Reed's voice was crisp, professional, and loyal. "How did he take the news?" "He hasn't received it yet," Julianna said, stepping out into the cool night air. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a sprawling grid of power and debt. "He thinks he just humiliated a beggar. He has no idea he just poured wine on his new landlord." "The paperwork is finalized," Marcus confirmed. "The Vance Group now holds 49% of the Sterling debt. One more move and you have the majority." Julianna looked back at the glowing windows of the Sterling mansion. Inside, she could see the silhouette of Alistair raising a fresh glass of wine, celebrating a victory that was already turning to ash. "Good," Julianna said, her voice turning to ice. "Contact the auditors. I want a full forensic sweep of Victor Thorne's accounts by morning. And Marcus." "Yes. Make sure the judge gets an invitation to the unveiling. I want him to have a front row seat when the Sterling legacy finally collapses." She ended the call and stepped into the black sedan waiting at the curb. As the car pulled away, Julianna looked at the wine stain on her dress one last time. It wasn't a mark of shame. It was a promise. The sleeping lion was finally awake, and she was hungry. The next morning, the glass towers of Sterling Real Estate shimmered with a deceptive, cold brilliance under the early sun. Julianna Vance stepped into the lobby, the rhythmic, sharp click of her heels on the polished granite sounding like a countdown. She paused for a moment, breathing in the scent of expensive floor wax and stale ambition that permeated the air. It was a smell she had known her entire life, one that used to represent safety, but now only smelled of rot. She didn't stop at the reception desk. She knew the layout of this building better than the architects who designed it. When she reached the top floor, the heavy brass door handle to the executive suite felt ice-cold against her palm. She pushed it open without knocking. Alistair Sterling was leaning back in a sprawling leather chair, a cloud of expensive sandalwood cologne following him as he turned. He didn't look up from his tablet immediately, his posture radiating the casual, unearned confidence of a man who believed the world was his footstool. "I told you no interruptions, Victor," he snapped, his voice tight with irritation. "Victor is busy," Julianna said, her voice a calm, low vibration that cut through the room. Alistair froze. He looked up, his eyes narrowing as they raked over her. He took in her simple, charcoal-colored suit and the way she stood, shoulders back, chin level, with a look of profound, visible disgust. He let out a short, mocking puff of air that was meant to be a laugh. "Julianna, I see you've finally crawled out from whatever hole you've been hiding in," he said, the screech of his leather chair echoing in the silent office as he stood. He walked around the mahogany desk, his movements predatory. "I suppose the wine stain from last night finally dried. Or did you come here hoping I'd offer you a job? I think we might need someone to restock the break room. You always were good at playing the martyr." "I'm not here for a job, Alistair," she replied. She didn't flinch as he stepped into her personal space, trying to use his height to intimidate her. "Then why, to beg for your inheritance again?" He leaned in closer, his sneer deepening. "Let me make this clear so even someone with your limited perspective can understand. You are damaged goods. You're a ghost in a house I own, and frankly, you're starting to bore me. You look like a stray dog looking for a scrap, and I don't have anything left to give you but a kick toward the door." The door behind them opened, and Victor Thorne stepped in. The CFO stopped, a slow, oily smirk spreading across his face as he saw Julianna. He walked over to the desk, casually leaning against it, the very desk that had belonged to Julianna's father. "Still here, Julianna?" Victor asked, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "You really should listen to Alistair. Your father's desk looks much better with Alistair's feet on it than it ever did with his. It's a new era. People like you, the sentimental, the weak, don't have a seat at this table anymore." Juliana felt the phantom heat of rage prickling at her skin, but she channeled it into a cold, hard focus. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick manila folder, sliding it across the mahogany surface. It landed with a heavy thud right in front of Victor. "I'm not here for the table," Juliana said, her eyes locking onto Alistair S. "I'm here to deliver this. The Vance Group has acquired the primary debt on this building and the surrounding parcels. As of 8 o'clock this morning, they have initiated a mandatory forensic audit of all Sterling real estate accounts, including yours, Victor." Victor's smirk didn't vanish, but his eyes darted toward the folder. Alistair laughed, a loud, booming sound that lacked any real humor. "The Vance Group." Alistair scoffed, gesturing dismissively at the papers without looking at them. "I've never even heard of them. Some bottom-feeding firm trying to make a name for themselves by rattling my cage? Tell your new bosses they're wasting their time. My lawyers will have them tied up in litigation until their grandchildren are gray." "You might want to read the fine print before you assume your lawyers can save you," Juliana said. She felt a surge of secret power as she watched Alistair's hand hover over the folder, his arrogance preventing him from actually opening it. He had no idea that the Vance in the company name was her own middle name, a tribute to the grandmother he had helped him fleece years ago. "Get out," Alistair said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. He stepped toward her, his face reddening. "Before I have security drag you out in front of the entire staff, you have nothing, you are nothing." Juliana didn't move. She checked her watch, a simple, elegant piece that Marcus Reed had tracked down from her father's seized collection. "The auditors will be here in 10 minutes. I'd suggest you clear your personal files, Victor, if you can." She turned toward the door, stopping only when she reached the threshold. She looked back at the two men who had orchestrated her ruin, seeing them not as giants, but as men standing on a floor that was already falling away. "Oh, and Alistair," she added, her voice echoing in the plush room. "Don't forget the unveiling gala is in 3 days. Judge Lawrence Miller is looking forward to seeing the Sterling legacy in all its glory. It would be a shame if you weren't there to greet him." She walked out, the heavy doors swinging shut behind her. As she entered the elevator, her hands were perfectly steady. The countdown had begun. 3 days until the gala. 3 days until the world saw what Alistair Sterling had worked so hard to hide. She pressed the button for the lobby, the descent beginning as a single, cold thought filled her mind. He has no idea he just signed his own eviction notice. The following morning, the air in the industrial district felt sharper, stripped of the artificial floral scents that choked the Sterling towers. Julianna Vance stepped out of her SUV, her boots clicking against the cracked pavement with a rhythmic precision that mirrored her heartbeat. She wasn't the ghost they remembered. She was the architect of their upcoming collapse. The warehouse she entered looked derelict from the outside, but the interior hummed with the low-frequency vibration of high-end servers. Marcus Reed was waiting for her in the center of the dim space, illuminated by the cool blue glow of 3 panoramic monitors. He didn't look up as she approached, his fingers dancing across a mechanical keyboard with a sound like rain on a tin roof. "I found the vulture's handshake," he said, his voice a low gravel that cut through the white noise of the cooling fans. Juliana leaned over his shoulder, the scent of bitter espresso and ozone filling her senses. On the screen, a series of encrypted bank transfers flickered into view. "Show me." "It's exactly what we suspected," Marcus said, clicking through a folder labeled with a string of alphanumeric characters. "Victor Thorne didn't just move the money to cover the Sterling losses. He used the Legacy Foundation's primary endowment as collateral for a series of high-risk offshore gambling debts. It's a literal suicide pact for the firm. If the board finds out the endowment is empty, the entire corporation triggers a mandatory liquidation clause." Juliana touched the screen, her finger tracing the digital signature of the man who had helped dismantle her life. "And the clause." "It's the best part," her ally replied, a grim smile touching his lips. "The Sterling bylaws state that in the event of criminal negligence by the sitting CEO and CFO, The controlling interest reverts to the primary blood heir, regardless of previous disinheritance. Alistair Sterling signed his own eviction. Notice the moment he let Victor touch those accounts. She felt a cold surge of satisfaction. It was the ultimate irony. Her father's obsession with bloodlines and legacy had created the very trap that would snap shut on his neck. She pulled an encrypted drive from her pocket, the metal casing cold against her palm. Upload everything to the secure server. I want Judge Lawrence Miller to have the physical copies by tomorrow evening, not a second sooner. While Julianna prepared her weapon, 5 miles away, Alistair Sterling stood in a private fitting room at the city's most exclusive tailor. The room smelled of expensive wool and the faint, metallic tang of a tailor's chalk. He checked his reflection in a 3-way mirror, adjusting the lapels of a midnight blue tuxedo that cost more than most families earned in a year. "The fit is perfection, Mr. Sterling," the tailor murmured, kneeling to pin a hem. Alistair didn't acknowledge the man. He was looking at his own reflection with the casual confidence of a god. Victor Thorne sat in a leather armchair nearby, nursing a glass of 20-year-old scotch. Despite the luxury of the setting, he looked frayed at the edges, his hand trembling slightly as he raised the glass. "She's bluffing, Alistair," Victor said, though he seemed to be trying to convince himself. "Julianna was always dramatic. She's probably living in some rent-controlled apartment, desperate for a payout. That comment about the gala was just a pathetic attempt to rattle us." Alistair turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. "She didn't look like a beggar, Victor. She looked like a predator. But it doesn't matter. She has no standing, no capital, and certainly no friends in this city who can touch me. By the time the unveiling gala is over, the judge will have signed off on the new development deal, and Julianna will be a footnote in a history book I've already burned." He stepped off the pedestal, his shoes buffed to a mirror shine. "I want her barred from the building. If she even breathes near the gala, have security handle it. I don't want that stain on my evening." "Of course," Victor replied, though his eyes darted toward the door. "But what if she really did find something in the files?" Alistair laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "The girl was a child when she left. She understands sentiment, not high finance. She's a sleeping lion, Victor. No. She's a stray dog barking at a mountain. Let her bark. It'll make the silence after I crush her that much sweeter." Back in the warehouse, Julianna watched the progress bar on the screen reach 100%. The room felt smaller now, the tension of the coming days pressing in on her. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, framed photograph she had kept for 10 years. It showed a younger version of herself standing in front of the Sterling estate, before the lies, before the betrayal. She didn't feel sadness looking at it. She felt a clinical, sharp-edged resolve. "The invitations for the gala were hand-delivered this afternoon," Marcus said, closing his laptop. "The judge is confirmed. Your mother is confirmed. The entire board will be in the front row for the unveiling." "And the guest list?" Julianna asked. "I've added one name to the digital registry," Marcus replied. "A VIP guest with full access to the stage and the media feed." Julianna nodded, her eyes fixed on the blue light of the monitors. She could almost taste the champagne that would turn to ash in her father's mouth. She could hear the silence that would fall over the ballroom when the truth was projected onto the 30-foot screens he had bought to celebrate his own ego. 48 hours, she whispered. She stood up and walked toward the exit, the heavy metal door groaning as she pushed it open. The sun was setting over the city, casting long, jagged shadows across the skyline. Somewhere in that maze of glass and steel, her father was toasting to a legacy that was already dead. He just didn't know it yet. She checked her phone. A single message sat on the screen from an unknown number. "The judge has the preliminary brief. He's asking questions." Julianna deleted the message and stepped into her car. The countdown had moved past the point of no return. She wasn't just going to the gala to reclaim her name. She was going to witness the exact moment Alistair Sterling realized that the daughter he had discarded now owned every brick of the empire he stood upon. She put the car in gear, her hands steady on the wheel. 2 days, Alistair, she murmured to the empty car. "Enjoy the view from the top while you still have it. It's a long way down." The day before the gala, The lobby of Sterling Global Headquarters smelled of filtered air and the sharp, clinical scent of expensive lilies. Julianna Vance stood by the massive marble reception desk, her fingers tracing the cold, polished edge of the stone. It was a building she had once expected to inherit, a fortress of glass and steel that now felt like a tomb waiting for its occupant. She watched the digital floor indicator above the executive elevators. When the doors finally hissed open, Alistair Sterling stepped out, flanked by a phalanx of assistants. He was adjusting his silk tie, his face set in that familiar mask of bored command. He didn't notice her at first, not until he was 10 feet away. When his eyes finally landed on her, his stride didn't falter, but his lip curled in a rhythmic twitch of pure condescension. "I thought I told security to update the trespass list," he said, his voice carrying easily across the cavernous lobby. 2 junior analysts stopped mid-step, their eyes darting between the Titan and the woman in the simple charcoal suit. Julianna didn't flinch. She felt the weight of the digital recorder in her pocket, a silent witness to the man's hubris. "I'm not here to trespass, Alistair. I'm here to offer you a courtesy you never gave me, a warning." He laughed, a dry, rasping sound that lacked any genuine mirth. He signaled for his entourage to keep moving, but he paused just long enough to lean into her space. The smell of his heavy, spiced cologne, the same one he'd worn the day he signed the papers to disown her, swirled around her like a suffocating fog. "A warning," he mocked. "From you, the girl who couldn't even keep her own name. Look around you, Julianna. This is an empire. You're just a ghost haunting the lobby of a life you weren't strong enough to lead." "The Sterling Foundation's debt restructuring," she said, her voice low and steady. "The primary notes were sold at midnight. You might want to check the buyer's signature before the gala tomorrow. It would save you a great deal of public embarrassment." Alistair's eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features before his ego slammed the door shut. He smoothed his lapels, his gold watch catching the light with a blinding, rhythmic flash. "I don't have time for your fantasies. Victor Thorne and I have handled the restructuring. We've secured the legacy while you were busy playing at business in the shadows." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Victor Thorne stepped out from the nearby cafe, a smirk already plastered on his face. He looked at Julianna as if she were a smudge on an otherwise perfect window. "Still trying to find a way back in, Julianna. It's pathetic, really, even for you." "Victor," she acknowledged, her tone ice-cold. "I see you're still holding his coat. I wonder if you'll be as loyal when the ship starts taking on water." Victor laughed, a sharp, sycophantic sound. "The only thing sinking is your relevance. Enjoy the view from the sidewalk tomorrow night. I'll make sure the valet gives you a nice spot to watch the real players arrive." Julianna watched them walk toward the revolving glass doors, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. She felt a vibration in her hand, her phone. She pulled it out to see a message from Marcus Reed. The judge just confirmed his attendance. He's bringing the full ethics committee. The trap is set. She looked up, catching a glimpse of a figure on the mezzanine. Evelyn Sterling stood by the railing, her hand clutching a designer handbag so tightly her knuckles were white. Their eyes met for a heartbeat. Her mother didn't wave. She didn't smile. She simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the upper floor, choosing silence over her own blood once again. Julianna didn't feel the sting she expected. Instead, she felt a profound, chilling clarity. She walked toward the exit, the heavy glass doors swinging open for her. The humid city air hit her face, a stark contrast to the refrigerated tomb she had just left. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, unassuming black invitation. It was the one Alistair had sent out to the city's elite, boasting of the Sterling century. She tore it in half, the sound of the thick cardstock ripping like a gunshot in the quiet afternoon. He had ignored the warning. He had looked her in the eye and seen nothing but a failure, never realizing that the vulture fund he so despised was the very woman standing in his lobby. 24 hours, she murmured, tossing the torn paper into a nearby bin. She stepped into the back of a waiting car where Marcus was already tapping away at a laptop. He looked up, his expression grimly satisfied. He didn't listen, did he? He never does, Juliana replied, her voice devoid of emotion. He thinks he's standing on a mountain. He doesn't realize it's a landslide. As the car pulled away from the curb, she looked back at the Sterling Tower one last time. The sun was hitting the glass at an angle that made the entire building look like it was on fire. She settled back into the leather seat, her pulse slow and rhythmic. The time for warnings was over. Tomorrow, the city wouldn't be celebrating a century of Sterling. They would be witnessing its funeral. The evening of the Sterling Centennial Gala arrived with a heavy, oppressive humidity that made the air in the grand ballroom feel thick with the scent of lilies and expensive cologne. Alistair Sterling stood at the center of the room, his chest puffed out beneath a bespoke tuxedo that cost more than most of his employees earned in a year. To the hundreds of guests swirling around him, he was the personification of old money power, a titan celebrating a century of dominance. He held a glass of vintage crystal, the amber liquid inside catching the light of the massive chandeliers. "A century of Sterling," he boomed to a circle of admirers, his voice carrying the practiced resonance of a man who had never been told to be quiet. "And we are just getting started. My father built the foundation, but I am the one who turned it into a fortress." Victor Thorne stood at his elbow, nodding with a sycophantic grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. The CFO's hands were trembling slightly as he adjusted his cufflinks, a detail Alistair was too intoxicated by his own reflection to notice. Nearby, Evelyn Sterling moved through the crowd like a ghost in silk, her smile brittle and frozen. She stopped to adjust a floral arrangement, her fingers lingering on the petals as if she were trying to ground herself in a reality that was rapidly shifting beneath her feet. "He's in a rare mood tonight," Victor whispered, leaning toward Evelyn. "He thinks he's invincible," she replied, her voice barely audible over the swelling strings of the orchestra. She glanced toward the grand entrance, her eyes tight with a mixture of dread and a secret, shameful hope. Alistair didn't see them. He was too busy cornering Judge Lawrence Miller near the mahogany bar. The judge was a man of immense gravity, his presence acting as the ultimate seal of social approval in the city. Alistair clapped a hand on the older man's shoulder, a gesture that was far too familiar for the judge's liking. "Lawrence, glad you could make it. Tonight isn't just about the past. It's about the future. Tomorrow, I'm announcing the acquisition of the waterfront district. The final piece of the legacy." Judge Lawrence Miller adjusted his spectacles, his gaze cool and discerning. "I heard there were some complications with the debt restructuring, Alistair. Rumors of a new firm moving in on your liabilities." Alistair laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that caused a few nearby guests to turn. "Vultures, Lawrence, nothing more. They think they can pick at the edges of a Sterling empire, but they'll find the meat is still very much on the bone. I've handled far greater threats than a few anonymous accountants." The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Julianna Vance stepped into the light, and for a heartbeat, the music seemed to falter. She was draped in a gown of midnight velvet that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. Her hair was swept back, exposing the sharp, aristocratic lines of a face that Alistair had spent a decade trying to forget. She didn't enter the room like a guest. She entered it like an owner. Marcus Reed followed a few paces behind her, his face a mask of professional indifference, though his eyes were constantly scanning the room, calculating the positions of every key player. He held a slim, leather-bound tablet against his chest like a weapon. Juliana didn't wait for an invitation. She moved through the crowd with a slow, rhythmic grace, her heels clicking against the marble floor with the precision of a metronome. Guests parted for her, drawn by the sheer magnetism of her confidence. She stopped 10 feet from the bar, her gaze locking onto Alistair. The color didn't leave Alistair's face. It intensified into a mottled, angry red. He set his glass down on the bar with a sharp asterisk clack that drew the attention of everyone within 20 feet. "Who invited you?" he demanded, his voice dropping an octave into a low growl. "I thought I made it clear that you weren't welcome on Sterling property, Juliana." Property is a funny thing, Alistair, she said, her voice calm and melodic, cutting through his aggression like a scalpel. It tends to change hands when people aren't paying attention. Evelyn stepped forward, her hand fluttering to her throat. Julianna, please, not tonight. This is your father's legacy. Julianna turned her gaze to her mother, and for a brief second, a flash of genuine pain flickered in her eyes before being replaced by a cold, hard shimmer. Legacy is earned, Mother. It isn't a birthright for those who trade their integrity for a seat at a table they don't even own. Victor Thorne looked like he wanted to vanish into the wallpaper. He caught Julianna's eye and immediately looked at his shoes, his face pale. He knew what was in the folder Marcus was carrying. He knew that the vulture fund Alistair had mocked was currently holding the notes on every single one of Alistair's personal properties, including the very ballroom they were standing in. Alistair stepped toward her, invading her personal space, trying to use his height to intimidate her. He smelled of expensive brandy and the sour sweat of a man who was losing control. You're making a scene. You always were a dramatic child, desperate for attention. Security will have you out of here in 2 minutes. I wouldn't call them just yet, Julianna said, her voice rising just enough to ensure Judge Miller and the surrounding board members could hear every syllable. I'm here as a courtesy. I thought you'd want to be the first to know that the Founders' Circle is under new management. Alistair sneered, leaning in close so only she could hear him. You're nothing. You're a footnote I erased years ago. You have no standing here, no name, and no power. You're just a bitter woman playing dress-up in a room full of giants. Julianna didn't flinch. She leaned in even closer, her lips inches from his ear. The scent of her perfume, something sharp and metallic, like rain on hot pavement, filled his senses. The giants are falling, Alistair, and the footnotes are the ones who are going to write the obituary. She pulled back, a small, terrifyingly serene smile playing on her lips. She turned to Judge Lawrence Miller and offered a polite, shallow nod. Judge, I believe you'll find the documents I sent to your chambers this afternoon quite illuminating regarding the Sterling estate's current solvency. The judge's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. He looked from Julianna to Alistair, his expression shifting from curiosity to a dawning professional concern. I see. I shall review them with the attention they deserve, Ms. Vance. Alistair's hand gripped the edge of the bar so hard his knuckles turned a ghostly white. He looked around the room, realizing for the first time that the whispers weren't about his success. They were about the woman standing in front of him. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that the very air felt charged with static. The toast is in 5 minutes, Alistair hissed, his eyes darting to the stage at the end of the ballroom where a microphone stood waiting. I'm going up there, and I'm going to announce the future of this company, and you're going to watch from the curb. Julianna checked the small, diamond-encrusted watch on her wrist. 5 minutes. Perfect. She turned her back on him, the ultimate insult in a room full of people who spent their lives vying for his attention. She began to walk toward the back of the room, Marcus falling into step beside her. Julianna, Alistair shouted, his voice cracking with a sudden, sharp desperation. She didn't stop. She didn't even look back. She simply raised a hand, 2 fingers extended in a silent countdown. As Alistair began to stride toward the stage, his face a mask of panicked fury, the lights in the ballroom flickered once, twice, and then settled into a low, dramatic dim. The giant projector screen behind the podium hummed to life, glowing with a stark, blinding white light. Julianna took her place near the exit, her hand resting on the heavy brass handle of the door. She looked at Marcus, who tapped a final command into his tablet. Wait for it, she whispered. Alistair stepped onto the podium, the spotlight hitting him with a harsh, unforgiving glare. He reached for the microphone, his hand shaking, his eyes searching the crowd for Julianna. He found her standing in the shadows at the back, her silhouette framed by the exit. She looked like a judge waiting to pass sentence. He opened his mouth to speak, to assert his dominance one last time, but before a single word could leave his lips, the first image appeared on the screen behind him. It wasn't a logo. It wasn't a picture of his father. It was a bank foreclosure notice, dated that morning, with the name Alistair Sterling highlighted in blood-red ink. The silence that followed the hum of the projector was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the grand ballroom. Alistair Sterling stood frozen on the podium, his silhouette bisected by the harsh red text of the foreclosure notice. For a heartbeat, he looked like a man who had been shot but hadn't yet realized he was bleeding. Then, the brittle mask of his composure shattered. He forced a laugh, a dry, rattling sound that lacked any of his usual booming authority. He looked toward the front row, his eyes wild as they landed on his CFO. "A glitch," he stammered into the microphone, the feedback screeching through the hall like a dying animal. "Victor, tell them, this is some juvenile stunt, a hack from a disgruntled competitor. It's a pathetic fabrication." Victor Thorne didn't look up. He was hunched over his phone, his thumbs blurring across the screen as he frantically scrolled through internal accounts. The smell of Alistair's expensive sandalwood cologne, usually a mark of his presence, was being overtaken by the sharp, acrid scent of nervous sweat. "It's no fabrication, Alistair," a voice cut through the murmurs. Julianna Vance stepped out of the shadows by the exit, the heavy brass handle still cold against her palm. She walked toward the stage with a measured, predatory grace, her heels clicking against the polished marble like the ticking of a countdown clock. She didn't look like the broken daughter they had cast out years ago. She looked like the storm that had finally made landfall. Alistair gripped the edges of the mahogany podium so hard his knuckles turned a ghostly white. "You," he hissed, his voice trembling with a cocktail of rage and dawning terror. "You did this. You think a few doctored images on a screen will change anything? I built this empire. I am the Sterling legacy." "You were the legacy," Julianna said, her voice calm and terrifyingly level. "But you were also a borrower. And you should have read the fine print when Vance Holdings started buying up your debt 3 months ago." The transformation in Alistair Sterling was visceral, a slow-motion demolition of a man's pride. The healthy, sun-kissed tan he'd cultivated on yachts in the Mediterranean seemed to curdle, turning a chalky, translucent gray that made his skin look like damp parchment. His eyes, usually sharp with predatory intent, widened until the whites were visible all around the irises, darting frantically like a trapped animal. His mouth hung open, his lower lip trembling with a rhythmic, pathetic twitch that he couldn't suppress. The veins in his neck corded, thick and pulsing, as if his very blood was trying to escape the humiliation. He looked smaller, the expensive tailoring of his suit suddenly appearing 3 sizes too large for a frame that had lost its skeletal rigidity. The room erupted in a cacophony of hushed gasps and the frantic rustle of silk. Judge Lawrence Miller, the man whose endorsement Alistair had spent the last year courting, rose slowly from his seat. He adjusted his spectacles, staring at the screen with a look of profound disgust. He didn't say a word, but the way he turned his back on the podium spoke volumes. He was a man who didn't associate with failures, and Alistair was currently the most spectacular failure in the city. Beside him, Evelyn Sterling looked as if she were about to faint. She clutched her diamond necklace, her fingers trembling as she stared at her daughter. She didn't offer a word of support to her husband. She was already looking at the other socialites in the room, gauging the exact moment she would become a pariah. "Vance Holdings doesn't just own your debt, Alistair," Julianna continued, stopping just a few feet from the stage. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a single, heavy document embossed with a gold seal. "We've exercised the acceleration clauses. As of 9 o'clock this morning, the Sterling Plaza, your flagship development, and this very building are under new management." Marcus Reed appeared at her side, holding a tablet that mirrored the foreclosure data. He nodded to the security team standing by the doors. The shift in power was almost physical, a weight moving from one side of the room to the other. Alistair lunged forward, his hand swiping at the air as if he could grab the words back. "You can't do this. I'll sue you into the ground. I'll have your head for this." Julianna didn't flinch. She simply looked at him with a pity that cut deeper than any insult. "You always told me I was a liability, Alistair, that I didn't have the stomach for the family business. It turns out I just didn't have the stomach for your version of it." She leaned in, her voice a cold whisper that carried to the first few rows. "I'm not your daughter tonight. I'm your landlord, and your lease on this life just expired." She turned on her heel, leaving him standing in the glare of the projector. As she walked toward the exit, she could hear the sound of chairs scraping and the low, urgent murmurs of the elite as they scrambled to distance themselves from the falling star. The doors swung open for her, and she stepped out into the cool night air, leaving the wreckage of the Sterling name behind her. The countdown was over, but the real work of dismantling his life had only just begun. The silence that followed Julianna Vance's departure was not empty. It was a heavy, suffocating thing that pressed against the gilded walls of the Sterling ballroom. For 5 seconds, the only sound was the rhythmic hum of the projector fan, cooling the lens that had just incinerated a 40-year legacy. Then, the air broke. Alistair Sterling finally found his voice, though it was a jagged, unrecognizable version of the baritone that usually commanded boardrooms. "It's a fabrication," he roared, his hands slamming onto the mahogany podium with a force that made the crystal water carafe rattle. "That woman is a thief. She's a disgruntled, delusional failure trying to extort this family." He looked out at the sea of faces, expecting the usual wall of nodding heads and supportive murmurs. Instead, he met a vacuum. The elite of the city, the very people he had spent the evening grooming with vintage wine and promises of exclusive developments, were backing away. It was a physical retreat, a literal widening of the circle around him as if his sudden bankruptcy were a contagious fever. Alistair's face was a landscape of ruin. The ruddy, self-assured glow of a man who owned the world had curdled into a sickly, gray pallor that made him look 20 years older in the span of a heartbeat. His eyes, usually sharp with predatory intent, were wide and glazed, darting frantically from the projector screen to the faces of the people he had spent a lifetime intimidating. His lower lip trembled, a minute, pathetic twitch that he couldn't suppress, and his jaw hung slack, as if the muscles had simply forgotten how to hold the weight of his mounting lies. Every breath he took was ragged, a visible struggle that made the expensive silk of his tuxedo waistcoat strain and flutter. He looked less like a titan of industry, and more like a cornered animal realizing the cage was made of its own bones. "Victor," Alistair barked, turning toward his CFO. Tell them those acquisition filings are forged. Tell them the debt is managed." Victor Thorne didn't move toward the podium. Instead, he took a deliberate step back, his hands raised in a gesture of sudden, clinical neutrality. The man who had been Alistair's shadow for a decade looked at him with the cold eyes of a scavenger, deciding if the carcass was still worth the effort. "The signatures on those documents are yours, Alistair," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "I warned you about the over-leveraging. I have the emails to prove it. I had no idea you were using the Vance holdings as collateral for the Sterling Trust. That was your private initiative." The betrayal was so sudden and so surgical that Alistair actually stumbled. The flip was instantaneous. One by one, the enablers began to pivot. "I always thought the numbers looked inflated," whispered a woman in the second row, a socialite who had been praising Alistair's vision only 10 minutes prior. "The greed is just staggering," another man added, shaking his head as he checked his watch, already looking for the exit. In the center of the front row, Evelyn Sterling sat as if turned to stone. Her hand was pressed to her throat, her fingers clutching a diamond necklace that, according to the documents on the screen, no longer belonged to her. She looked at her husband not with sympathy, but with a dawning, horrified realization of her own impending social death. When he reached out a hand toward her, she didn't take it. She looked away, her eyes searching the back of the room for the daughter she had traded for a title that had just turned to ash. "This is a matter for the authorities," a deep voice boomed. Judge Lawrence Miller stepped into the aisle. He didn't look at Alistair, he looked at the documents still glowing on the screen. He was the city's moral compass, the man whose endorsement Alistair had spent millions to secure. The judge adjusted his glasses, his expression one of profound, icy disappointment. "I've seen enough. These aren't just business failures, Alistair. This is systematic fraud. I suspect the district attorney will be as interested in these creative acquisitions as your creditors are." "Judge, please, you know me," Alistair started, his voice cracking. "I thought I did," Miller interrupted. "But it seems I only knew the man you were pretending to be. Julianna Vance, on the other hand, has provided a very clear picture of who you actually are." The sound of heavy doors swinging open at the back of the hall drew every eye. Marcus Reed entered, flanked by two men in dark, understated suits. They didn't have the flash of Alistair's private security. They had the quiet, bureaucratic lethality of the law. Marcus walked down the center aisle, his stride echoing on the polished floor. He stopped 10 feet from the podium. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, "the receivership is effective immediately. We have a court order to secure all company servers and personal assets. You are requested to vacate the premises." "Vacate?" Alistair gasped, his hands gripping the podium so hard his knuckles turned white. "This is my house. This is my event." "Actually," Marcus replied, pulling a single sheet of paper from his jacket, "as of 4 p.m. today, this estate was transferred to Vance Holdings as part of the debt settlement you signed last month. You're a guest here, Alistair, and the owner would like you to leave." The room erupted into a fever of whispers. Alistair looked around, searching for a single friendly face, a single person who would stand by him. He found only the cold lenses of smartphones, recording his downfall for the world to see. He looked at the judge, who turned his back. He looked at Victor, who was already deep in conversation with a legal aid. Finally, he looked at Evelyn. She stood up, smoothing her dress with trembling hands. "I'll be staying with my sister," she said, her voice a fragile reed. She didn't look at him as she walked toward the exit, leaving him standing alone under the harsh glare of the projector. Alistair Sterling was escorted out of his own ballroom, his footsteps heavy and hollow. He didn't fight. He didn't scream. The arrogance had been drained out of him, leaving nothing but a shell of a man who finally understood the price of the life he had stolen. Outside, the cool night air hit him like a physical blow. The valet line was a chaotic mess of luxury cars fleeing the scene. He stood on the gravel driveway, the sound of his own name being dragged through the mud echoing from the open windows behind him. Julianna was gone. She hadn't stayed to watch the arrest or the weeping. She had delivered the truth and moved on, leaving him to drown in the silence she had created. He reached into his pocket for his phone, perhaps to call a lawyer or a friend, but his hand came back empty. He realized then that he had nothing left to say and no one left to listen. The empire was gone. The family was broken. And as the first police cruiser pulled into the long, winding driveway, Alistair realized that the nightmare wasn't ending. It was only just beginning. 6 months had passed since the night the Sterling name transitioned from a symbol of royalty to a cautionary tale whispered in the back corners of country clubs. The winter frost had melted, giving way to a sharp, clinical spring that mirrored the new atmosphere inside the skyscraper at the heart of the financial district. The gold lettering on the lobby wall no longer read Sterling Holdings **. It had been replaced by a minimalist, brushed steel logo, Vance Acquisitions. Julianna Vance sat in the corner office on the 50th floor, the very room where Alistair Sterling had once told her she was nothing more than a liability to be managed. The scent of expensive teakwood and old leather had been replaced by the crisp, clean aroma of white tea and ozone. She leaned back in the ergonomic chair, her fingers tracing the edge of a crystal paperweight. It was cold, heavy, and undeniably hers. The door opened with a soft chime. Marcus Reed stepped in, carrying a leather-bound folder. He looked different than he had during the months of their shadow war. The frantic energy of the investigation had settled into a quiet, professional satisfaction. He placed the folder on the marble desk, his eyes catching the light of the afternoon sun. "The final liquidation is complete," Marcus said, his voice steady. "The last of the Sterling residential properties sold this morning." The proceeds have already been diverted to the victim restitution fund as ordered by the court. Julianna opened the folder. Her eyes scanned the numbers, millions of dollars that had once been used to buy silence and influence, now being funneled back to the families Alistair had crushed. And Victor Thorne. Sentencing was finalized yesterday, Marcus replied. The enabler doesn't get a soft landing this time. Judge Lawrence Miller saw to that. 10 years in a federal facility. Victor tried to strike a deal at the 11th hour, offering up more of Alistair's offshore accounts, but the judge wasn't interested in mercy. He told Victor that some debts can't be paid in cash. Julianna felt a ripple of dopamine at the news, a small, sharp win that tasted better than any champagne. She remembered the way Victor had smirked at her when he thought he was untouchable, the way he had helped Alistair forge the documents that nearly erased her existence. Now, he was a number in a system he could no longer bribe. "And what about Alistair?" she asked, her voice dropping to a low, calm register. Marcus hesitated, then pulled a tablet from his bag. He swiped to a photograph taken only 2 days ago. He's living in a studio apartment in the East End. It's a 4th-floor walk-up in one of the districts he used to call economically irrelevant. He's been spotted at the local grocer using a bus pass. No one looks him in the eye anymore. To the city, he's a ghost. Julianna looked at the image. Alistair Sterling, the man who once wouldn't step out of a limousine unless a red carpet was rolled over the sidewalk, was standing at a bus stop in a light drizzle. His designer coat was frayed at the cuffs, and his shoulders, once broad with the weight of stolen power, were hunched against the wind. The arrogance had been replaced by a hollow, frantic look, the expression of a man realizing that without his money, he was invisible. It was the ultimate face slap, delivered not by a hand, but by the slow, grinding gears of reality. He had spent his life building a throne out of other people's lives, and now he was forced to walk the very streets he had looked down upon. "He called the office again this morning," Marcus added. "He wanted to speak to you. He said it was about family obligation." Julianna felt a cold knot tighten in her chest. Family. He only remembers the word when he needs a lifeline. She stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. Below, the city was a hive of activity, thousands of people moving through their lives, unaware of the private wars fought in the glass towers above. She thought of her mother, Evelyn Sterling. Evelyn had called Julianna 3 weeks ago, her voice trembling, full of apologies and excuses. She had begged Julianna to help Alistair, to preserve what was left of their dignity. Julianna had listened to the woman who had watched her be cast out and said nothing. Then she had hung up. The cost of her victory was the total severance of the only family she had ever known. It was a heavy price, a lingering ache that sat behind her ribs, but it was a price she paid willingly for the sake of the truth. "Don't take any more calls from him, Marcus," Julianna said, her reflection in the glass looking back at her with eyes that had seen too much to ever be soft again. "He doesn't have a family anymore. He has a legacy, and this is it." She looked down at her hands. They were steady. The wine stain on her soul from years of being the victim had finally been scrubbed clean, leaving something harder and more resilient underneath. She had won. She had the building, the assets, and the justice she had craved. But as the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the office floor, Julianna realized that the view from the top was much quieter than she had imagined. The silence wasn't just peace. It was the sound of a clean slate. She picked up her bag, the leather smooth and familiar. She didn't look back at the desk or the files. She walked out of the office, the click of her heels on the marble floor echoing with the finality of a closing door. The empire was gone. The monster was broken. And for the first time in a decade, Julianna Vance walked into the evening air knowing that no one was following her. The nightmare was over, but as she stepped into the cool night, she knew the scars would remain, a permanent map of the woman she had been forced to become.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.